But first, the Albanese government might be taking some comfort tonight that it's still ahead in the polls, 54-46, and that its rate on super savings has a 2-for-1 approval. But voters can be attracted to an idea it's still not like the way it's done. More than likely, though, I'd say a good proportion of people really don't understand it or don't think it'll impact them, especially the young. And if that's right, well, they're wrong, given the cap on super isn't indexed over time, so more and more people, particularly the young, will be caught by it. But regardless of the policy detail, by any measure, the government's been sneaky, giving one impression before an election and doing quite the opposite afterwards. And the people whose super will be hit and their families are likely to bear a grudge against this government far deeper than the superficial approval of those who think that heavier taxes and broken promises never apply to them. Now, in the end, governments flourish or fail on the basis of whether they're taking the country in the right direction. And today, one of our country's foremost policy experts, the long-serving former head of the Productivity Commission, Professor Gary Banks, said that Australia is going backwards on energy, industrial relations, tax and government spending, with the public losing confidence in democracy and the nation facing new sovereign risk problems. Now, I can't recall a more scathing assessment from a senior former public servant, especially one who helped drive the reforms of the Hawke and Howard eras. His most telling comments were about energy, where he told The Australian that we had written off our comparative advantage, so much so that electricity was, and I'll quote him, becoming an unreliable luxury. Here's his energy broadside, where he says the monumental bungling of the so-called energy transition has seen governments maximise the cost to the nation of reducing emissions, while evidence-based policy has been abandoned in favour of what he calls simple-minded belief. We're in a situation, says Gary Banks, where it's becoming impossible to openly discuss the best way forward. Any attempt, he says, to use evidence or logic immediately brands you as a denier. In the Ukraine, power stations are destroyed by Russian missiles. In Australia, he says, we blow them up ourselves. And we do this, says Gary Banks, without having a way to replace the critical 24/7 service they provide. But if that's not bad enough, our governments are making it hard for gas to step into the breach and dismissing nuclear out of hand. Talk about daft. I suppose there should be no satisfaction in further detailing all the damage we're doing to ourselves, but at least Professor Banks is corroborating the judgments of this program. Here he is on workplace policy. He says, and I quote, on the other hand, we've been busily eliminating our comparative advantage in energy, while on the other, we're reviving our traditional disadvantage with respect to labour. Now, you'll have heard me discuss this time and time again. In Australia, two of the biggest inputs into our businesses is energy and labour costs, or labour costs meaning the salaries we pay our workers. Now, we're never going to be able to compete with the price workers are paid in our region because Asia has some of the lowest paid workers in the world. And with a high population, there's plenty of them. So we're always going to be ahead of the game, though, when it came to energy. That's our history, because so much of what we need for baseload power, we're blessed to have in the ground here in Australia. Unlike in Asia, places like Japan and China, well, they have to import it from us. But not anymore, because we've squandered our energy advantage. And as Banks says too, we're now going backwards on labour because we're putting back in the sort of workplace inflexibility that Hawke and Keating took out. On the issue of government spending, Professor Banks had this to say. He said, while education spending's gone up, student attainment has gone down, at least by OECD standards. Health spending, he says, has continued its upward trajectory, but indicators of performance continue to languish. Then there's the fiscal sinkhole he calls the NDIS, a painful lesson about the unintended consequences of policy on the run. I'll say that again, the fiscal sinkhole called the NDIS. Gary Banks doesn't get any more brutal than that. And the conclusion from the former head of our Productivity Commission, well, he says, I never thought the sovereign risk issues prevalent in certain third world or socialist countries would one day afflict my own. damning assessment from a policy expert. But here's the challenge. Is there any contender for government proposing to reverse policy on any of these issues? Essentially, Green left Labor, so unlike the Labor of Hawke and even Paul Keating, is an enthusiast for all of this folly. And the coalition, frightened by focus groups, is often just Labor light. I mean, look at New South Wales. By the end of next month, April 28, the Liddell Power Station will close. Now that's 10% of the state's power, our nation's most populous state. By 2025, another coal-fired power station, the giant Eraring generator, well, that's gone too. Now, that's over 20% of New South Wales power. Add them together, that's a third of the state's baseload in under 3 years gone, and no plan from anyone to replace it. This is exactly the point that Banks is underscoring today. And with an election in under 20 days, some hints, well, I thought there were hints from the New South Wales Energy Minister Matt Keane, that if re-elected, the state government might intervene to keep Eraring open now that the regulator is warning, if it isn't, blackouts will come. This is the same Keane, of course, that knocked back earlier requests from Eraring. And in any event, by late afternoon, Keane's office quashed reports of support, saying instead he's only interested in a giant battery. Now, a good part of the problem here on energy, as identified by Gary Banks, is weak politicians like Keane who've driven this breakneck transition to renewables with no plan for replacement baseload. Indeed, the only reason Keane popped up today is the fact that the power bill issue, cost of living, is key in the New South Wales election. Indeed, a Roy Morgan poll over the weekend shows the Liberals are bleeding votes on the right, hence Keane is trying to walk back his hard left position on energy, but to no avail. Already, it's 11 minutes to midnight for energy security in Australia. And if every policymaker and MP across the country did just one thing tonight, and that's to read what Gary Banks has said today, there might be some reason for hope. Otherwise, as they say, it's the definition of insanity to keep doing the same thing over and over again, but expect a different result. Matt Keane, are you listening?